Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about dehydrating your own homemade bone broth. Now, as of yet, I do not have a specific video out on making bone broth. I don't do anything fancy. I just do it my own way. For example, let's say I have a leftover turkey from Thanksgiving or the leftover chicken bones and all that from a roasted chicken. Then I just throw in some water. I usually already have spices in there, and then just a splash of some homemade wine. I prefer not using vinegar, and then I'll cook it down for 2 days on top of the wood stove. And in the summertime, if I'm doing it in the summertime, I might use my solar oven, or I use the hot plate plugged into our solar power. Typically when it's chicken, I just turn that broth immediately into a soup after that. So I strain it out, strain out all the bones, add any more herbs and spices that I think sound good, vegetables, potatoes, maybe some barley, whatever sounds good to me at the time, and then put that on the wood stove and cook that. But in the winter, when we do the turkey for Thanksgiving, that's when I put up the broth because we're making such a big batch at a time. And so for several years in a row, I've simply just been freezing the excess, whatever I'm not going to turn into a soup right away. And so I finally decided it was time to get into dehydrating the broth to make more room in my freezer. My initial plan was to just once I had enough jars in there, to go ahead and can the whole batch. I was going to do that. But after getting more serious about dehydrating things I had not tried before, outside of fruits, vegetables, and herbs, such as dehydrating the eggs from my chickens, I decided it was time to try the broth because I've been so happy with the way everything else has been turning out. Plus, the biggest bonus of all is the space that it saves in the freezer or pantry. So that's why I decided to finally do that. So right here, and I have to apologize because I lost count of how many jars. I kept pulling jars out of the freezer. I didn't realize I actually had that many in there. So in this 1 pint jar, I know there's at least a minimum of 8 pints of broth in here, but I'm pretty sure it's more. And then this is the second one that I had started. I have 3 more jars of broth right here. These 2 I just pulled out of the freezer. This one's been out for a while and I need to get busy on that. So I'm going to finally get the last of the broth out of the freezer and get that dehydrated up today and tomorrow. So I wanted to go over my process. Now, just understand, I don't follow anyone else's directions when it comes to stuff like this. I just do it. I just try it my own way, and if it works, it works. So if you're following other people's channels and they have different ways of doing things, just understand, everybody's going to have their own way. It doesn't make one way more right than the other. It's going to be very dependent on the person. So I just want to go over what I did. So this last year, was finally able to find some edged silicone trays for both my dehydrators. I have several Nesco dehydrators, and I wanted to get away from using the plastic because silicone is a little bit safer. Normally, if I'm doing things that are dry stuff, I use cloth. I use cotton cloth on my trays, both these for the Kasori and for the Nesco. But when you're doing liquid items, obviously you need something to contain the liquid. You can use parchment paper and clip up the edges so that it holds everything in. That's one option, but I'm always looking for things that are also reusable so I can wash it and reuse it again and again. And silicone is safer than plastic when it comes to that. Mostly right now though, because this time of year I don't have my Nesco set up because mostly those are run outside or in the hallway here plugged into the solar power. During the time of the year we're getting plenty of solar power collection. Where currently my Kasori is set up in the other room so I can use it any time of the year. So that's what I'm using here. Now if you're interested in these silicone trays, they do make them in the 3 different ones. One for the Excalibur, so it's more square shaped, it's a little bigger. The set for the Kasori and the set for the Nesco. The ones for the Nesco are actually the least expensive ones, but they hold quite a bit. So I just brought them both in here so you could see it. When you're doing something like a Nesco, it's easy when you're dealing with liquids because you can just stack the tray, pour your liquid on there, stack another tray. Just make sure your dehydrator is set up in the place you want it to stay while you're dehydrating. Anytime you're dehydrating liquids, whether it be eggs, milk, broth like I'm doing here, and so on. And so for the Kasori, because you can't just stack and pour, it is best to go ahead and make sure the tray is mostly into, or at least halfway in, but you're still going to have to support it with one hand as you're filling it up. Otherwise it kind of will tilt a little bit and some of it can pour out. Now for the Excalibur, I don't know if it holds the trays perfectly level when you've got them partially pulled out or not. I can't say, but just use your judgment on that. And so as I'm filling it, you know, I do have that part way into the Cosori. So you got it being held in place here, and then pull it out enough that halfway seems to be good for me so I can see better what I'm doing and easier fill. And no matter how little I pull it out, I still find it best to support it with my other hand. And then I just pour the jar of thawed out broth on there and then make sure it's pretty evenly distributed. I found for the Cosori, in most cases I can hold almost 2 cups of the broth on here. On these, I would say up to 3 cups you could probably hold, and I assume that would be the same for the Excalibur because they're bigger. So it's going to depend on your dehydrator trays and what you have. If I'm dehydrating delicate things or anything I'm dehydrating on silicone, I always set it at the lowest heat. So there's a couple of reasons why. For example, when I'm doing the eggs, because the eggs are raw and I want to keep them raw, I don't want to heat them to 170 degrees because I want to keep them in a raw form because I'm going to bake with them or cook with them. And that's better for the eggs when you're going to use them in cooking and baking to keep them raw, even though they're powdered up. And then when I'm doing something that's using silicone or plastic, it doesn't matter. I still don't like going above, even if it's something I don't care if it gets cooked while it's drying, I still don't like going up above 115 degrees because the hotter these things get, whether it be the plastic or the silicone, the more chance you are of getting toxins into your food. Again, coming back to the silicone, it is safer than the plastic trays that you get with your different dehydrators. Even if you are using the plastic, I don't recommend going any higher than that. And for that temperature, I found it takes a minimum of 12 hours for it to fully dry if I've got the tray very full. Sometimes I have to run it longer. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind, like you'll see here in this thawed out jar, there's chunks of fat in there. So if you're like me and you like to leave the fat in your bone broth, that's going to be up to you whether or not you want to take it out when you go to dehydrate it. I leave it all in there. So because of that, just like with the eggs, you'll find that it'll be oily. When it'll be dry, but it'll be oily. And how you tell is just try crunching it. If it just wants to fold like fruit leather, then put it back in your dehydrator for a couple more hours and check it, and just keep checking it until it's really dry. Because most likely what's happening is you have areas that are thicker than others, or areas where maybe, especially like in my case where I had it frozen, and maybe some areas were just more watery than others, which means the areas that stayed a little more watery and the areas that were more gelatinous, those areas are going to take longer to dry. Even though it might have looked totally flat, totally level, you're still going to see that. So you might want to, if you froze it first, you might want to shake it or stir it really good. I didn't think to do that. I just dumped it on there. But just keep in mind, again, that fat is going to leave a lot of oil on there. So you've got a couple options. If you're able to remove the fat because you've had it refrigerated and it did separate and solidify, you can just scoop that out with some kind of fork, spoon, whatever. Or you can just leave it in there, let it dehydrate. Then you can dab some of it off once it's dry if you feel like it's too much fat, or you can be like me and just leave it in there. Because I want that flavor. I want that good healthy fat in there. So then what I did is once I got it dry enough that I could pretty much powder it up, you can either use your blender. Usually when I'm doing a lot of something, I'll just go ahead and use the blender. If I'm just doing a little bit at a time, I'll use my coffee grinder that is only for doing anything other than coffee. So any food related items like this, I just powder it up like that. It doesn't have to be perfectly powdered. You'll see that mine isn't a perfect powder, but also because of the fat content, it will kind of clump together. So you can see better in here, and you can even hear that there's chunks in there. I'm not worried about that because how I'm going to use it. I don't care if it's not a perfect powder form. So at this point, what you can do, if you've got a lot of fat in it and you feel more comfortable, like I decided to go ahead and freeze these. Because like this, I know it's taking up at least a minimum of 1/8 of the amount of space that it took up before I dehydrated it. So I'm still saving a lot of room. Or you can do like I've done with the eggs, with leaving all that fat in there. I just vacuum sealed them into the jar and put it on the shelf. And I know other people have done this before too. And the vacuum sealing will help keep it fresh. It's not going to prevent the fat from going rancid though. So if you don't have a place to store your things like your broth or your eggs or any of the meat that you want to leave the fat in that you've dehydrated, you may still want to store it in the fridge or the freezer. But anyway, it's going to be a matter of choice. It's going to depend on your climate. It's going to depend on how cold or warm your food storage area is. But just remember that I did a video a while back I did a couple, one about storing fats, one about storing meats in fat. And generally speaking, if you're keeping it in a cooler place, in a root cellar or a pantry that tends to stay cooler, you should not have any issues of it going rancid. I actually never have. So as a result, I feel pretty certain I could just go ahead and vacuum seal this and stick it back in my pantry, which is what I'm planning on doing. Oh, and by the way, one of the easiest ways with getting the stuff off your silicone trays, which is another reason why I like the silicone better than plastic, is that you can just roll it right up. And that can make it easy to crunch it. Just roll it right up and just crunch it like that. And that will help loosen it up. And then you can basically just pour it into your blender or into your coffee grinder. And that's whatever it is that you're drying like that. Some things will just peel right off easily enough. I've done that where I've peeled whole pieces off, like I did when I was dehydrating the tomatoes. It will come off just like a leather. Some things do want to adhere a little more to the silicone than others. It just depends on what it is. If you do better than I did on this and keep track of how much actually went into this, so how many cups of broth did you actually dehydrate up to fill this jar, that will give you an idea. Like I said, I know there's at least 8 pints, which would mean there's at least 16 cups in here. And so if that's the case, if I've got 16 cups, with that in mind, looking at that math, roughly what we're going to be looking at when I go to rehydrate it, then what I'm going to want is about 1/8 of a cup of the powder to 1 cup of water to make approximately 1 cup of broth. Now, here's the great thing. It's all about how thick you want it, how much flavor you want it, just like I did with the pumpkin. When I did the math, that came out about like that. However, that really doesn't matter. What really matters is how much flavor and thickness do you want. It's just going to be totally depending on you and what it is you're making. Maybe you're making a gravy out of it and you want it a little thicker and the flavor even more intense. That's what makes dehydrating things like this even more beneficial, is that you can tailor that flavor even better and the consistency by just adding as much as you want to the water. So I recommend just playing with it. You don't have to use any specific measurements, just go off that basis. So again, make sure you're keeping track if you want to have at least a guideline of how much you need of the powder to water ratio. And then from there, just do whatever you want with it. It's totally up to you. And again, if you choose to keep the fat in or not keep the fat in, that again should be totally up to you. Everybody's going to have their different opinions and thoughts on that. For me personally, because I know there's a lot of good there's a lot of good flavor and benefits in the fat of these different things, I prefer to go ahead and keep it in. Yes, it's not going to give you as dry of a powder, but it's going to be healthier all the way around. The same thing goes with the eggs. I would not remove any of the fat from the egg yolks because you need that in there, especially when you're using it in baking, like making your quick breads and your pancakes and anything like that. You need all parts of that egg in there. Now, to be honest, I have yet to use the broth powder in anything. So the next time I do beans and cornbread, I'm definitely going to be trying the turkey broth powder, and I'll be doing an update on that down the road. But this was just about the dehydrating and the storing and how to do it, or how I do it anyway. And somewhere down the road when I use it more, I will go ahead and share my experiences there. And please, if you're one that's already been dehydrating your broth and using it in various things like gravies and soups and sauces and whatever it is you're using it in, or you're even just using it to get more of that bone broth in your daily diet. Maybe you're taking a little bit every day. Share with us all that and how you use it. So anyway, don't forget to open up the description box by clicking on either show more down here below my channel name in all caps, or if you're on a smart device, that little gray arrow right over here to open up the description box to find all the links, video links and so on that I'll be putting down below, as well as the links to the silicone trays if you're interested. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.